I really sort of went back and forth all morning about whether I should talk about this Bari Weiss situation or not. And I decided to talk about it at least as an introduction into exploring whether some bigger discussion is required. So let me explain to you what's going on and then we'll talk about it. Bari Weiss was, up until yesterday, a New York Times opinion columnist. And yesterday she wrote a resignation letter, which she published on her website. And the resignation letter led to the entire sort of social media sphere being abuzz. Different people for different reasons, but everybody from, I think Don Jr. tweeted about it, all the way to the folks in the so-called intellectual dark web and sort of like everybody in between. And I think what the letter says is one piece of it, and the reaction is another piece, and I want to talk about both. Now, Bari Weiss was hired by the New York Times in 2017 to write about culture and politics, and she became significantly more well-known when she wrote a widely disseminated piece about the intellectual dark web. And she's appeared on Bill Maher's program. She's appeared on a number of different programs. And when she published this resignation letter yesterday, the social media space exploded for different reasons, but all with the assumption and the understanding that this resignation letter is a bombshell blockbuster indictment of the New York Times and of media, intolerant media more generally. And, during the day, I was seeing this stuff in little fits and spurts, but I was busy with this bogus urgent press conference that Donald Trump held and covering the expanding war between the White House and the medical community on coronavirus. We had another death surge to nearly 1,000 deaths, record deaths in multiple states. We had multiple live streams yesterday. So it wasn't really until last night that I even read the resignation letter. I slept on it. I looked at it again today. And I have to tell you, I've looked at this thing 6 ways from Sunday, I think the phrase is. Excuse me if I've got that one wrong. I'm not sure that there is actually that much to discuss in terms of this being a bombshell, other than it really seems like the New York Times isn't the right place for Bari Weiss to do her writing. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't dislike Bari Weiss, nor do I think her work is bad. I don't always agree with her conclusions, but she's done some reasonable work. She has done some interesting pieces about ways in which anti-Semitism is often ignored, or oppression is not taken as seriously when it comes to the Jewish community. And I've been talking about that for a long time. I think there's different standards there. I think she's reasonably interested in that topic and sort of does pretty good coverage there. She's way off on a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's okay, right? Like, that's not a personal problem I have with her. That would apply to, listen, Andrew Sullivan, who I'm going to mention later, a conservative. Sometimes he says things I agree with. And a lot of what he says I disagree with. It doesn't mean I want him fired or his voice suppressed or whatever the case may be. Now, let's dig into the letter itself. Maybe the most notable part of the letter is a paragraph about the relationship between the New York Times and social media, where she says, quote, "Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As the ethics and mores of that platform have become those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first rough draft of history. Now history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative." In another paragraph, she sort of seems to issue an indictment of what was allowed to take place at the New York Times and says that, quote, "Showing up for work as a centrist," referring to herself, "showing up for work as a centrist at an American newspaper should not require bravery," clearly implying that the New York Times has become some kind of radical left-wing publication, and her centrism required her to be brave to show up in the face of and despite recriminations and all sorts of attacks on her, not physical, but ideological. So in general, she is arguing that the New York Times increasingly is catering to a very narrow audience, and that anybody looking to put out something outside of that narrow scope of opinion is just like not really allowed or welcome at the New York Times, both from the point of view of the publication, but also just in terms of her feeling like she was just not treated particularly well at the New York Times. She wasn't in the in crowd at the New York Times because of her differences of opinion, which to me relates more to a toxic work environment than it is a criticism of the New York Times as a journalistic institution. And that's where I get to my first sort of primary point here. When you see a letter like this, and then you start reading the responses, often the responses are very generalized. And it's sort of like, are people responding to what she says about the New York Times as a media outlet or what she says about the New York Times as an employer? Because toxic work environments are unfortunately very common. And we need to distinguish in looking at her letter, what is she asserting about how she felt while working at the New York Times, which is completely valid? And what are her criticisms about the New York Times as a media institution, which can be argued and are up for debate? I mean, for example, she argues that the New York Times is now catering to the narrowest slice of the political spectrum. If that's the case, it would be reflected, presumably, in decreased viewership of the New York Times because it appeals to a smaller and smaller slice of the population. So we could look at that empirically. I happen to know what the answer is, but I don't think it's particularly relevant to this story. But the New York Times is actually doing quite well. Now, you could argue, well, it's because they've decided just to criticize Trump. Okay, but now we're in a gray area all of a sudden. There's some interesting criticisms that I want to look at that focus on the media piece that are much more broad than the New York Times. But the bombshell about the New York Times that some are pointing to here, I'm just not seeing it. Now, first and foremost, from the point of view of opinion, the New York Times is basically a center-left publication. They've correctly, I mean, listen, to say they're biased because they do a lot of Trump critiques, Donald Trump is a uniquely bad actor who has done things no president has done before, where every week, never mind, sometimes every day, there's a new scandal. So the New York Times, as a center-left paper that also does investigative journalism, has been correctly criticizing a lot of Donald Trump's presidency. And remember, there was no big pro-Bernie voice at the New York Times. There was also no big pro-Trump voice at the New York Times. And that's the point. It's center-left, sort of in line with MSNBC, but they do more investigative journalism, which is a separate department than the opinion side. The New York Times, from an opinion perspective, seems widely in line with the Democratic Party. Both are center-left. Now, if your problem is, I don't want the New York Times to be center-left, okay, that now we can talk about that. But the New York Times as some radical place is just wrong. It's empirically wrong. Secondly, there's the idea of what is considered outside the Overton window for the New York Times. And Bari Weiss talked about this. What is or isn't acceptable to say or publish at the New York Times? And from Bari Weiss's perspective, the Overton window is too narrow at the New York Times. It doesn't include certain perspectives. And as a result, she feels like her work was demeaned and not maybe given the placement or seriousness that she believes it deserves. That's completely legitimate. And it genuinely does seem like her work was not best placed at the New York Times. But that's not strikingly different from saying the National Review wouldn't be the right place for a lot of stuff. Fox News is not the right place for a lot of stuff. I believe Bari Weiss is genuine when she says that the environment at the New York Times was not the right place for what she writes. And I still want her to write. And it's okay if the New York Times isn't the right place. She also says that the work environment was hostile in a day-to-day perspective. And I have no reason to doubt that. There is no shortage of toxic and hostile work environments. But let's not mix the two things. And importantly, she wasn't silenced. She wasn't fired. She determined she didn't like the work environment and the way which her work was received. And that's a very different thing than the bombshell that many people are making this out to be. Now, there's a separate issue here, which we have to talk about in terms of her criticism of the New York Times as a journalistic endeavor. And there's no shortage of criticism of the New York Times. And in general, I agree that Too many media outlets are catering to social media as a primary doorway to their content, and social media and shareability of content and journalism has changed how the New York Times and just about every media outlet behaves. But that is not the widespread indictment that maybe some are making her letter out to be. So, in total, as I read the piece, I see very little that's unique to the New York Times other than Bari Weiss worked there. And her relationship to the Times is different than to the National Review or some other publication. Every media outlet has biases which come from ideology or corporate structure, from availability bias, from a desire to maintain access to people in positions of power, whatever else. Maybe at the New York Times, the bias has sort of one shape. At the Wall Street Journal, the bias has a different shape. At the Washington Post or the Washington Times or Fox News or CNN or the David Pakman Show, biases are shaped in different ways. That's a big, complex issue that's widely studied in media literacy classes. But the idea that some journalistic outlets don't want a full range of political opinion represented, that's not new. I mean, that applies to us, right? I control the preponderance of certain types of ideas that are put out on my program. I exclude some stuff. There's some stuff that would be a bad fit for this program. If it didn't work out for Bari Weiss at the New York Times, she's completely right to leave. And her critique of how she felt from a personal perspective there is completely valid. But I don't see the bombshell here that many are making it out to be. I'm willing to have my mind changed. Now, one last thing. Andrew Sullivan has also announced that he's leaving The Atlantic at the end of this week. I would not be surprised if there's some announcement coming about some new endeavor where Bari Weiss and Andrew Sullivan and maybe others are going to be involved. We'll see if we soon learn about that.